Probably the most significant theoretical conclusion that I've come from looking at Second Life and looking at the web entirely is that much of postmodernist theory about human identity and really human existence is perhaps either wrong or incomplete. When I started to do my studies in Second Life several years ago, I was inspired by two feminist postmodernist theorists. Well, feminist was Donna Haraway and Sherry Turkle, who's a postmodernist theorist. Sherry Turkle applied the theories of deconstruction and the concept that an individual may actually define themselves in any multiple number of identities. The concept of Windows is not necessarily Microsoft Windows, but that the user opening up different windows, and then when that user opens up that window, they assume a different personality, which they can construct. That the same person can construct multiple different types of identities and personalities. Donna Haraway saw cyberspace and the cyborg as a possibility for constructing narratives of a new gender that broke out of the binaries of male or female. So these very standard postmodernist concepts. When I started looking at Second Life, I thought that that's what I would see. What I've seen, though, is clear just that this is not the case. As for gender identity, I've seen quite the opposite, that Second Life seems to promote a hyper gender expression, a hyper gender identity, so that the actual use of the technology, rather than opening up the possibility to go transgender, with the exception of a very small minority, isn't used, and in fact people create supergender identities. As for the concept that one could comfortably exist in a universe of multiple windows into reality, each one constructing a separate self, I've seen all the evidence indicating that that is really not is not acceptable to people. In fact, we have a concept in psychiatry of that. We call it schizophrenia. And what I'm seeing more and more, that people are trying to consolidate their personality, that the Jungian concept that we seek wholeness of ourself is actually really a strong insight, that we are looking to be a single holistic person, that our entire life work is in a way to create a single one of us, and that a simple change in technology, it isn't acceptable to people to have multiple different kinds of self that they can be, that this is actually somewhat of a pathology. And what I'm now starting to look at with the technology we call Web 3.0 is the fact that people are ultimately going to use technology to reinforce their own day-to-day construction of a single, potentially consistent, coherent, and meaningful identity in relationship to their community and to their society. That they, rather than being able to amass and suture onto a number of different identities, they are going to want to be themselves, their one person, and they are going to want to use their tools, which will become more and more mobile tools, to guide them in negotiating their relationship to their local community and assisting them in finding features of their community and communicating to people more and more a single consistent self. I found I've been experimenting with Foursquare right now for a year, and I've seen how geo-positioning and publishing places you go quickly fills into a single narrative story that I want to tell about myself. There's positive things that I want to be. Then these are the things that I keep constantly checking into. Whenever I go to the gym, I check into the gym. I check into bookstores. I check into academic venues. I want Twitter and Facebook to represent me as a person, as a single person who's striving for some aspiration. I know it sounds very Victorian in 19th century, but what I'm finding more and more is that I'm not looking to the theories of Derrida and Deleuze and Foucault as much to understand the internet, but that more and more I'm looking to the Freudian, Lacanian, and the whole Frankfurt school in trying to understand potentially how fantasy can influence our web reality, but how our seeking out a singular identity structures our fantasy space. And I'm looking more and more in Second Life as a kind of direct dream relationship to the real life. And what I'm seeing is that people's Second Life identities they construct are very much fantasy arrangements to reinforce and strengthen issues that they're having in real life. Now, how do you assume that the rapid change in identity that we may see in Second Life, it's, I think, should be more not viewed as people ability to construct new identities out of discourse rapidly, but the fact that we can assume different identities repeatedly every night in different dreams, or we can watch and take the sides of very, very many different protagonists. But all of this has to be understood as a fantasy space of a single person. And I find myself, oddly enough, returning back to Jung and thinking that this single person strives for a wholeness and consistency in their personality. So for me, I think that, and Sherry Turkle did say this, that the web would put postmodern ideals to the test. I think that they haven't really proved their worth, and that really, if you want to see who is really saying the most sense about cyberspace and IP, it's somebody straight out of the Frankfurt School of a combination of Marx and Freud, which is Zizek, or Zizek. His name's pronounced differently by different people, but he's the individual I think is saying the most insightful things right now, and he utterly rejects the postmodernist project. So that's sort of my heavy intellectual insight in goofing around and having cyber sex in Second Life.